Hey, missed me? No worries, me neither. Today we're gonna take a look at something a little different. This is a game project I've been working on and off for the recent 2 years. I've been a bit shy about showing this since it's still a little early, but hey, you gotta start somewhere. So I thought the best idea was making a devlog and hopefully keep releasing a few of those every year to keep people updated about the state of the game. So without further ado, here's a first look at Lightyears from Home. So this game basically started out as a bit of a passion project of mine that I'd usually work on whenever I had some downtime from writing music. Like so many others, I grew up with video games and often played with the idea of making my own game at some point. So I would often sit down and write on a couple of ideas that would usually revolve around one topic, and there was always the exploration of faraway worlds and distant planets, as I've always been a bit of a fan of space opera. Right now the game is only being developed by me, myself, and yours truly, which is why things have been a bit on the slower side with this. I'm hopeful that this devlog will garner some form of attention by other developers, as I feel like I'm slowly approaching the point where I'm gonna need to put together a small team to build somewhat of a prototype of the game, but more on it later. So what you're currently seeing is supposedly the first area of the game to which the player will frequently return to. This dense forest is located on a fairly large plateau and somewhat of a safe zone for the player to freely explore, gather supplies, and manage their inventory. I started concepting and building the landscape in World Creator, which made the initial world building a lot easier. I then took the top-down perspective and did a bit of a concept of the starting area, which later helped me building pretty much everything in Unreal. We make our way to a small pond here, where things are getting a little bit warmer and a lot more overgrown. I already finished a scene a long time ago, and I guess I was so proud of it that I immediately put it on Twitter, so if you're one of the few who's been following this account, then you might have seen it already. The water surface you're seeing here is actually using a rather fancy render-to-texture feature, also called planar reflections. This method is fairly demanding of the hardware, as it basically renders the scene with a second camera, so to optimize it I added a huge amount of tweaks, from having the reflective scene only render at 50% resolution to downright handpicking which objects are being reflected in the first place. I think in the end all the tweaking was worth it, as opposed to the standard screen space reflections, these are a lot more stable, as they don't disappear whenever the area that is supposed to be reflected goes off screen. I still remember being asked if the scene was just a fancy in-engine render, so I'm finally happy to show that this actually runs in real time. But let's continue through this wintry forest and make our way to the next area. The build you're seeing here already has fully implemented level streaming that is driven by streaming volumes and blueprint triggers. I figured you can only have one planar reflection at a time, so these are being dynamically streamed in and out as we approach these watery areas. This keeps the memory footprint low and can in some cases dramatically reduce the rendering load, to which I'll get back later, I guess. What you've been hearing in the background is the soundtrack I've been already working on for a while. The bulk of it is already on this channel, and then next week I'll make sure to upload another track that I already meant to share for weeks now. I've been planning to release a bit of a mini soundtrack for this later on this year, but at first I want to finalize 1 or 2 more tracks and maybe have some more instruments recorded for it. So this large area is planned to be a bit of a hub that a player would often return to. The idea behind these springs is that... look at the birds! They don't even fly against the trees, almost never. Good thing it landed there, it's like the 10th recording. So, yeah, where was I? The idea behind these warmer ponds is that the plateau you're on is basically a large volcano that has various geothermal hotspots. The steam would constantly rise up, gather in the trees, and then drip down from the leaves again, creating a rather humid environment where everything is somewhat wet and shiny. The ground textures all use tessellation, then in addition to that they are also overgrown with grass, various plants, and
Glaucoma.
Let's just call it ground ivy. I figured these tiny plants add a nice second layer of detail and make a great alternative to grass. In addition to that, they can also be used to dress trees as well as other assets close to the ground, such as these rocks, which are from the Megascans library. A lot of these trees are covered in these as well, as I found it necessary to add another detail layer to especially large trees to ground them in the environment a little better. Shout out to Maui United and their amazing tree libraries, by the way. I started out making the first trees in SpeedTree, but was never fully satisfied with the results and eventually replaced the ones I made with these photogrammetry-based assets, which ended up looking a lot more natural. The lighting here is actually fully dynamic and makes use of Unreal's mesh distance fields. Let's take away the sunlight and change to a more overcast lighting situation to better show the fully dynamic distance field ambient occlusion. I think in the last generation it was often the case that a game looked great in bright sunlight, but the moment you took away the sun, it all started to look a little flat. I guess one could always use pre-baked lighting found in games such as The Last of Us, but that sadly wasn't much of an option here, as it seemed incredibly hard to implement with a day-night cycle as well as a weather system. So, going fully dynamic was the only way. I implemented mesh distance fields early last year, and it immediately looked like hot garbage and needed a whole lot of tweaking. Which might have been another contributing factor as to why I haven't shown anything of the game in a while. The new lighting is fully tweaked now whatsoever and provides some really nice ambient shading for those shadowy areas. The goal here was to make the game look good during various times of day, and I feel like implementing this system brought me a little closer to it. I'm definitely considering upgrading to Unreal Engine 5 once it hits and try out its new global illumination system, which would bring the visuals to new highs and possibly the frame rates to new lows. But we'll see about that. For now, let's have a look at this massive landscape that I mentioned earlier on. One of the reasons for putting the player so high up is to constantly convey a certain sense of scale, so whenever they walk to the edge of the forest, they would always be able to gaze over this massive landscape that constantly reminds them that they're alone out there, at least for the first part of the game. Despite the scale, I wouldn't really call this an open world game, as the story and progression are supposed to follow a much more linear metroidvania-style path. The game, however, is supposed to encourage exploration and even make use of backtracking, as there's already some areas in the forest here that can only be reached through a double jump that the player is supposed to be getting at a later point of the game. For now though, we're slowly reaching the end of our little tour as I'm making my way towards the pine forest, which leads us to the open plateau. This area actually used to be another pond, but I completely rebuilt it a couple of months ago since it didn't have much of a purpose. It's now more of a transitional part you go through as you make your way to the plateau, and also serves the level streaming a bit by loading a fairly large open area. For demonstrative purposes, I made it so the outside area streams in pretty late, so it should appear any moment now. Almost there. There we go. I'm planning to split up the data streaming later on, as of right now it's loading one massive chunk, which causes a bit of a hitch. So we finally made our way outside of the forest, where temperatures are getting a whole lot colder. From here the player is subjected to the extreme conditions of the planet and might even encounter some enemies. This is the plateau, and this is where the adventure begins. thanks for sticking all the way to the end. For somewhat regular updates, make sure to check out the game's Twitter or follow my personal one. I'm currently looking to put together a small team to help with the development, so if you want to apply or just generally help out, feel free to send a mail to denny@autodidactic.ai.